I never imagined I'd live long enough to feel betrayed by my own blood. At 78, I thought life had taught me all the lessons it could, that I had seen the worst and the best of people. And yet that morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling faster than I wanted it to, I realized that even in my old age, the world could surprise me. Not with strangers, not with misfortune, but with my eldest son, Thomas. Thomas, the boy I had raised with endless patience, the boy I had taught to be clever, the boy I thought would carry forward the values I had spent a lifetime trying to instill. He came into the room with his usual polite smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He carried a small stack of papers, neatly aligned, as if the weight of them alone could impress me. "Dad," he said, his voice calm, rehearsed, "I put these here so everything's in order. You won't have to worry about a thing." I looked at him and nodded slowly. Inside, I felt a quiet fury, but I held my expression. Memory doesn't vanish so easily, I reminded myself. It hides, it observes, and it never forgets. Thomas had been subtle at first, a pill swapped here, a bottle mislabeled there. "For your memory," he had said, and I let him believe I was slipping. But I wasn't slipping. I was learning. I was noticing. Every glance, every hesitation, every carefully timed smile, every suggestion about who should handle which property, which account, which document, all of it. He wanted me to believe I was helpless, that I would be confused, that I would hand over everything without even realizing what I had done. I took a sip of my coffee and let it burn the back of my throat, just to remind myself that I was alive, that I was still here. The living room smelled faintly of old wood and sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. The family photos on the wall stared back at me. My late wife smiling, our children as teenagers, their small hands in mine. All of it was mine, built by me, piece by piece, with sweat and long nights and sacrifices I had made so they could have more than I ever did. And now the son I trusted most wanted to rewrite all of it as if I were no longer capable of remembering or caring. I let him talk, let him explain the documents, let him push for signatures. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when he smiled, even hummed a line from an old song he once loved, to make him think I was soft, distracted, fading. He didn't know I had memorized every clause in those papers, every potential loophole, every legal turn he had counted on to take advantage of me. And as he spoke, I reflected on the irony of it all. How many times had I told him, cleverness without respect is nothing? How many nights had I stayed awake, worrying over mistakes, teaching him lessons about honesty and integrity, only for him to think that knowledge itself could be turned against me? I could see the wheels turning in his head. He thought I didn't notice. He thought he was a step ahead. But here's the truth. An old man who has built everything from nothing doesn't forget how to rebuild again. Not easily, not fully, not if he is patient. And patience is sharper than any lawyer, stronger than any forged signature, and more enduring than any inheritance. That morning, Thomas didn't just bring papers. He brought a test. He didn't just hand me documents. He handed me an opportunity. And I, sitting at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold in my cup, felt something I hadn't felt in years, alive, awake, aware. Because the day he thought I was helpless, that was the day I started preparing to remind him that memory, cunning, and patience still belonged to me, even if my hair was gray and my hands trembled. I set my cup down, slowly, deliberately. I looked at Thomas, let the silence stretch, and allowed him to fill it with words, with persuasion, with subtle threats. I let him believe I was unsure, that I might falter, that I might sign without question. And in that room, beneath the warm morning light, I realized one immutable fact. He had underestimated me. And that, my friends, is a mistake that can cost more than money. Because I remembered every lesson I had ever taught, every trust I had ever given, every deception I had ever seen. I remembered enough to protect what was mine, enough to teach a lesson he would never forget, enough to prove in the quietest and most devastating way possible that wisdom outlasts manipulation, and that sometimes the oldest hands in the room are the ones that hold the sharpest knives. The days after that morning passed slowly, but in a way that made every second feel heavier than it had a week before. I watched my house like a general surveys a battlefield, each room a position, every hallway a line of defense, every familiar corner a checkpoint. Thomas didn't know I was observing, and that was the point. He believed I was fading, fragile, distracted by age, lost in my memories of garages, repair shops, and hard-earned dollars. But I was more alive than I had been in years. The more he tried to manipulate, the more I remembered. He began subtly, small things at first, almost laughable if it weren't so cruel. A utility bill placed under a pile of papers, a letter from the bank that accidentally never reached me, a casual question about an account that he already controlled. "Dad," he said one evening over dinner, leaning back in his chair like a man who had already won. "I just want to make sure all your affairs are in order before anything happens." I smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes, and I let him think he had fooled me. "Of course, Thomas," I said softly. "I appreciate your help." But inside, my mind was running circles around him. I remembered the first time he had learned how to negotiate at my side, the way he observed every customer, every employee, every decision I made, picking up tricks like a student hungry for shortcuts. That boy was clever, too clever, and he had grown into a man who thought intelligence alone could manipulate the world, including me. I began keeping track of everything. Every conversation, every gesture, every subtle attempt to sway my decisions. I even began recording small notes in a journal, tucked away on a high shelf he never noticed. "Trust is earned, not inherited," I wrote that night, staring at the dark ceiling of my bedroom. "And betrayal is revealed slowly, like a shadow moving across the floor." Susan, my daughter, noticed too. She didn't even try to hide her impatience when I asked her to pass the salt at dinner. A tiny flicker of disdain in her eyes as she replied, "Sure, Dad, whatever you need." And Michael, my youngest, the one with a quiet conscience, watched it all, his silence a shield I had come to rely on. He had never been the ambitious type, never the one to scheme, but even he felt the tension. The family had become a living chessboard, and every meal, every interaction, was a new move. One afternoon, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The pill organizer Thomas had brought over, the one he insisted was for my memory, had been tampered with. A few pills were missing, some dosages rearranged. I could have confronted him immediately, screamed, accused him, but I didn't. That would have given him the upper hand. Instead, I waited, I watched. I let the lie fester, let him believe it was working. It was during one of these quiet days that the subtle war escalated. He invited a lawyer over to explain some new documents, a thinly veiled attempt to get me to sign away authority over my own accounts. He arrived with polished shoes, a stiff suit, and an air of arrogance that made my skin crawl. "We just want to make things simple, Dad," Thomas said, glancing at me as if I were a child. "You don't need to worry about the details." I smiled politely, nodded, and listened. Every word they spoke, every question they asked, I filed away in my mind like a meticulous accountant. I let them assume I was confused when I paused, let them believe I was struggling to understand the legalese. But I wasn't struggling. I had memorized it all. I had traced every transaction, every property deed, every account statement. I knew exactly what Thomas wanted, exactly what he feared I might remember. That night, alone in my study, I went through the documents again. The lawyer had left them on the desk, expecting me to be overwhelmed. I spread them out, pencil in hand, marking every clause, every signature line, every footnote. I traced the handwriting of the contracts, noting discrepancies, things only a lifetime of experience could reveal. I smiled as I realized how easy it would be to turn his game around. And then came the moment that truly confirmed it. Thomas's first major mistake. He underestimated patience. He underestimated memory. He underestimated me. During dinner the next evening, he handed me a fresh stack of papers, confident, almost smug. "Dad, these need your signature tonight. Everything will be easier once it's done," he said. He didn't notice my gaze linger on the faint tremor in his hands, the forced edge in his voice, the slight hesitation that gave him away. He thought he had trapped me in time, a frail old man who could barely remember breakfast. I looked at him calmly, deliberately. "I think we should review them together," I said, "just like we always did." He blinked, a pause, surprise, the first crack in his confidence. I didn't press. I let him feel the small shift in the room. Let him sense that the old man at the table was not as helpless as he had imagined. That night, when everyone else had left, I sat alone with my journal and my notes. I reflected on how subtle manipulation can be almost invisible, like water eroding stone. I realized that Thomas had been patient. For him the goal was the end game. But patience alone is nothing without awareness. And I had awareness. I had the entire history of our family, our business, our lives, tucked into my mind and my careful notes. It was during those hours of quiet that I began to plan. Not revenge, not punishment, strategy, a way to teach him a lesson without ever raising my voice, a way to show that intelligence cannot outmatch wisdom, that cunning cannot outpace experience, that the hands that built a life can protect it even in the face of betrayal. I didn't know when the moment would come. It could be next week, next month, or even tomorrow, but I knew it was coming. The pieces were moving on the board. The son who thought he was ahead was walking straight into the trap that patience had prepared. And I, 78 years old, standing on a lifetime of hard-earned lessons, was ready. Because this wasn't just about money. It wasn't about property. It was about respect, about memory, about proving that even in old age, a man who built everything from scratch doesn't crumble quietly when others try to steal it. He waits, he observes, he learns, and when the time is right, he strikes, not with anger, but with clarity. And I had never felt sharper. The evening arrived colder than usual, the wind rattling the old window panes, carrying the smell of damp leaves and distant smoke from neighbors' chimneys. I had spent the entire day preparing, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with quiet calculation. Every word Thomas might say, every gesture he could make, every assumption he carried about my age and frailty, I had anticipated. I had memorized it all. And now the time had come to make him see what patience and memory could do. He arrived promptly, just as I knew he would. Polished shoes, neatly pressed suit, and that same self-assured grin I had seen too many times. Behind him, the lawyer carried a briefcase, stuffed with papers and contracts, each one carefully designed to shift control away from me. They believed I was helpless. They believed the old man they had grown up with had finally lost his edge. "Dad," Thomas said as he stepped into the living room, "I brought everything. We can go over it tonight and get this settled. It'll make life so much easier for you." I nodded slowly, taking my time as I rose from my chair. My hands trembled slightly, a natural age thing, nothing more, and I let them see it. A subtle illusion of weakness, nothing more. "Of course," I said, my voice calm and deliberate. "Let's sit." We settled at the dining table, the warm glow of the overhead light reflecting off the polished wood. The papers lay before us, neat and organized, the lawyer hovering silently. Thomas exuded confidence. He had been rehearsing this moment for weeks, maybe months. He believed he was walking into a room with a man too old to fight back. "First," he said, "we'll review the property deeds. The house, the rental units, the land outside town, just sign here, and everything will be clear." I nodded again, picking up a pen, but I didn't sign. Not yet. I began reviewing the documents slowly, deliberately, letting my eyes linger over the clauses, the names, the minor details he assumed I would overlook. I hummed a quiet tune from my youth, something Thomas didn't recognize, something only I remembered, a subtle signal to myself that I was alert, focused, ready. Thomas began speaking faster, trying to mask his impatience. "Dad, really, there's no need to take so long. Everything is standard." I looked at him, calm, piercing. "Standard," I repeated, savoring the word, "is in the eye of the beholder." I smiled faintly. "But you know, Thomas, I've always been particular about details. You remember, don't you? I taught you that one small mistake could cost everything." His smile faltered slightly. The lawyer coughed awkwardly. I could feel it, the first crack. Thomas didn't notice it, but I did. As we continued, I began to question him carefully, deliberately, asking things only someone who had built every piece of this life could ask. "When did you last update the account records for the rental property?" I said casually. "I noticed the last entries were out of order. Were there other discrepancies?" Thomas froze, a small flicker of panic crossing his face. He stammered, attempting to maintain control. I think, Dad, it should be fine. The lawyer, I held up my hand, a signal that silenced him completely. "I see. You believe I wouldn't notice, that I am weak, that I cannot remember or verify." His eyes darted toward the lawyer, pleading for support. The lawyer, hesitant, shuffled papers nervously. And in that moment, I leaned forward, tapping lightly on the table, letting my fingers drum with a rhythm only I could control. "Thomas," I said, slow and deliberate, "I remember everything, every account, every property, every transaction. I know who tried to manipulate what, and I know who has been trying to control me from the shadows." The words landed like stones. His posture stiffened, the first real fear appearing in his eyes. He had underestimated me. He had thought that age, trembling hands, and gray hair were signs of defeat. They weren't. They were camouflage. I pulled my journal from the side, laying it on the table. Pages filled with my handwriting, meticulous records, notes about every subtle move he had made, every slight attempt to hide or misdirect. "I've documented everything," I said. "Every attempt to convince me I was helpless, every pill mismanaged, every letter delayed, every contract altered. All of it is here." Thomas leaned back, trying to regain composure. "Dad, you can't." I cut him off. "Watch closely," I said. "Because patience has a way of revealing truth in a way cunning alone cannot. You've been clever, Thomas, too clever, but cleverness cannot outpace wisdom, experience, and a memory that has been sharpened over 78 years of life." I began going through the papers slowly, highlighting discrepancies, pointing out errors that only someone deeply familiar with our finances could notice. I traced his handwriting, questioned timing of signatures, cross-referenced property sales with account entries. With every line, his confidence crumbled. The lawyer looked from him to me, unsure, hesitant, suddenly aware that they were in a room with someone who had underestimated. By the time I had finished, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Thomas sat frozen, a mixture of anger, shock, and fear on his face. His smugness had vanished. My calm demeanor had done what my words alone could not. It revealed the truth. I leaned back, folding my hands, and said softly, deliberately, "The lesson here, Thomas, is simple. Memory, awareness, and patience are stronger than manipulation. Wisdom outlasts impatience. And a man who built everything from nothing does not crumble quietly when someone tries to take it from him." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the recognition dawning. Not admiration yet, not respect fully, but fear, the kind that wakes someone in the middle of the night, making them rethink every move they thought was clever. He had been playing chess against someone who had already seen the entire game. That night after they left, I sat alone at the table, journal beside me, a cup of coffee cooling untouched. I reflected on how easily people assume age equals weakness, and how devastatingly wrong that assumption can be. Thomas had learned something tonight, though he wouldn't admit it. I had proven, quietly but unmistakably, that patience, memory, and intelligence can outsmart ambition and deceit, even within your own family. And as I closed the journal and looked out the window at the darkened streets, I realized something else. This was far from over. They would continue to test me, continue to plot, but now they knew. Now they feared the old man they had tried to fool. And that fear, that subtle recognition, was the first step toward balance, toward respect, toward the lesson I had spent my life hoping to teach. Because in the end, power is not in what you can take, it's in what you remember, what you protect, and how quietly, almost invisibly, you outsmart those who underestimate you. The days after the confrontation passed like a slow, tense storm. The house, which had once been filled with familiar, comforting sounds, laughter, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional bark of the neighbor's dog, now seemed to breathe uneasily. Every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of wind against the windowpane felt like a reminder that something had shifted. Thomas no longer smiled as easily. He didn't even glance at me the way he used to, the arrogance in his eyes replaced by a quiet calculation, a new respect, edged with fear. But the others had yet to see the depth of what had occurred. I moved deliberately through my house, my mind always working, always observing. Susan came by one morning, feigning casual concern, brushing past the living room like she belonged, though I could feel her calculating, measuring. "Dad, how are you feeling today?" she asked lightly, eyes darting toward the papers on the table. Her tone was polite, but I smelled the impatience behind it, the desire to influence, to push. I smiled at her. "Better than yesterday," I said softly, letting the words hang in the air. "And you? Still busy with your projects?" She hesitated. "Yes, well, you know, always." I nodded, making no move toward the documents she wanted. Instead, I leaned back, taking a slow sip of coffee. The silence stretched between us, thick and tense. Susan thought she was testing me. She was wrong. Every movement, every glance, every word she spoke, I stored in my memory, noting patterns, weaknesses, and the small cracks in her carefully constructed facade. Michael, my youngest, watched from the background. Quiet as always, but observant, the kind of child who had grown up not speaking unless necessary, but listening to everything. His loyalty was obvious, but I also knew he feared conflict. He had never tried to manipulate me. He had never even questioned my decisions. But I could see his anxiety. He sensed the undercurrent, the invisible chessboard we were all moving across. And I would need him, not as a weapon, but as an ally, someone who understood that the game was bigger than greed, bigger than inheritance. That afternoon, I made my first deliberate move, a small adjustment, nothing obvious, nothing grand, but enough to send a ripple through the family. I called the lawyer, asking to clarify a few details in the accounts, pretending to be forgetful, confused, even slightly frail. They believed me. The lawyer, eager to stay in Thomas's good graces, brought the requested documents over, confident, polite, unaware that I had already memorized every number, every account, every discrepancy. When the lawyer left, I spread the papers across my dining room table, the same table where Thomas had tried to trap me, and I went through them meticulously. Every altered payment, every missing signature, every attempt to manipulate was now catalogued. I marked each one carefully in my journal, not just for myself, but for the day I would show the entire family, not in anger, but in undeniable proof. That evening, Thomas tried again. Dinner, same table, same tension, same rehearsed smile. "Dad," he said, pushing a new set of documents across the table. "Just sign here. We've made it easier for you. Nothing complicated." I looked at him, calm, unshaken. "Easier," I said softly, letting my words settle like stones in the air. "I've been reviewing these all day. Some things don't add up. Care to explain?" Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the papers. I think it's just a clerical oversight. Nothing serious." I leaned forward, my voice steady, almost cold. "Oversight?" I repeated. "Do you know what I remember, Thomas? I remember every transaction, every detail of every property, every contract. I remember the times you tried to mislead me, and I have proof." I pulled out the journal, opening it to pages filled with notes, annotations, and carefully tracked discrepancies. The meticulous handwriting, the dates, the careful record of pills, letters, and documents, all evidence of the subtle manipulations Thomas had tried to execute. The room fell silent. Thomas froze, his arrogance crumbling, replaced by something I had rarely seen in him: fear. Susan's eyes widened. Michael watched silently, relief and awe flashing across his face. I continued, calm but deliberate. "This isn't punishment. This is awareness. I want you all to see that the person you underestimated is still here. I've lived long enough to know that cleverness without wisdom is fragile, that ambition without respect is dangerous, and that old men, even in the quietest ways, can see the truth more clearly than you realize." Thomas tried to recover, but the air had shifted. He no longer led the conversation. He no longer smiled. He spoke softly, carefully, choosing words as if they were fragile glass. Susan didn't attempt to challenge me. She simply sat, stunned, realizing for the first time that her subtle manipulations had been noticed. Michael finally spoke, quietly, saying only, "Dad, I'm glad you saw it," and I nodded, acknowledging him silently. The moment was subtle but significant. Control had shifted. The family now understood, without me needing to raise my voice, that the game had changed. I wasn't merely defending myself. I was setting the tone for the future, a future where respect, memory, and intelligence mattered more than greed, impatience, or ambition. Later, alone in my study, I reflected on the events of the evening. The house was quiet again, but the tension lingered, a heavy, invisible weight. I poured a cup of coffee, watching the steam curl upward, and smiled faintly. This was just the beginning. They would test me again. They would try to reclaim what they thought was theirs. But now they knew. They had seen the depth of my awareness, the sharpness of my memory, the quiet power of patience. I wrote another note in my journal. Power isn't in taking. Power is in remembering, in observing, in quietly outsmarting those who underestimate you. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the warmth of the lamp, the comforting familiarity of the worn leather and polished wood, and thought about what came next. The family had seen the first move, the quiet war had become visible, and the final lessons, the ultimate reckoning, were still to come. Because this wasn't about anger, this wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity, about teaching a lesson in a way that would resonate for years, and I, 78 years old, who had built everything from scratch, was ready to see it through, patiently, deliberately, and without ever losing control. The house was quiet that morning, but the silence was heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I had not slept much the night before, not from worry, but from anticipation. Everything had been set in motion. Thomas had begun to understand that I was no ordinary old man. Susan had glimpsed the edges of the truth. Michael, quietly, had been observing it all and silently cheering. Now it was time to finish what patience had begun. I had prepared a simple breakfast, black coffee for me, toast for whoever would join. The table was neat, my notes carefully stacked beside me, but in plain sight. The journal, my quiet weapon, lay open, inked pages filled with observations, reminders, and proof. Every manipulation, every attempt at deceit, every subtle betrayal was documented. They could see it, if they dared look closely enough. Thomas arrived first, of course. He lingered in the doorway, hesitation in his eyes, that subtle tension that betrayed his inner turmoil. I poured my coffee slowly, taking deliberate sips, pretending to savor it, though every fiber of me was alert. He shifted uncomfortably, finally muttering, "Dad, we should talk about the papers again." I looked up at him and smiled softly, letting the calm wash over the room like sunlight through a dusty window. "Yes," I said, "we will. But today I want to talk about more than just papers. Today I want to talk about trust, respect, and memory, because it seems to me those are things some of you have been testing." Thomas's shoulders stiffened. He tried to hide his unease, but I had already seen the cracks, and I leaned in slightly, just enough for him to feel the weight of my gaze. You thought I had forgotten, I continued, voice steady, measured, deliberate. You thought that age would dull my awareness, that my hands shaking and my hair gray meant my mind was weak. But memory, Thomas, doesn't vanish, it hides, and wisdom never leaves. Susan appeared behind him, fidgeting slightly, eyes wide. She had seen the tension the night before, but she still didn't fully understand. Michael came in quietly, watching, silent, a careful observer. I gestured toward the table. Sit, let us review everything together. I placed the journal in front of Thomas first. This, I said slowly, is what happens when someone underestimates the power of observation and patience. I opened it to pages filled with careful notes, timelines, and proof of every subtle manipulation, every misplaced letter, every altered pill, every attempt to shift authority or obscure control. It was all there, in black and white. Thomas's face went pale. I could see the storm in his eyes, anger, disbelief, fear, all mixed into a mask he struggled to maintain. Susan gasped softly, her hands clutching the edge of the table. Michael leaned forward slightly, silent, but a small smile of relief flickered on his lips. This isn't about punishment, I said calmly. It's about awareness. It's about showing you what happens when you take for granted the experience, the memory, the patience of someone who has spent a lifetime building something from nothing. I began to go through the journal slowly, deliberately, pointing to subtle errors Thomas had made, highlighting discrepancies in the documents, explaining how small manipulations could have been uncovered if not carefully tracked. Each revelation landed like a weight on the table, each observation a silent declaration. I was not to be fooled. By now Thomas was shaking slightly, unsure whether to argue or retreat. Susan's hands trembled. Michael leaned back, finally realizing the full scale of what had been happening, the quiet cunning that had gone unnoticed for months. I let them sit in silence for a moment, letting the tension swell, letting the lesson sink in. Then I spoke again. You see, the world doesn't reward greed or cunning alone. It rewards awareness, patience, and the ability to see the full picture. You can plot, manipulate, deceive, but never underestimate the person who remembers everything, who observes everything, and who acts only when the time is right. I leaned back, folding my hands across the table. Thomas, Susan, you have learned something today. Michael, I hope you have as well. But this is not anger, this is clarity. The house, the accounts, the property, it remains mine, yes, but more importantly, the lesson remains yours. Respect those who came before you. Respect what has been built, and understand that intelligence without wisdom is fragile. Thomas finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. Dad, I understand. I nodded slowly. Good, I hope you remember it. The room was quiet again, but this time it was different. The tension had shifted. The fear in Thomas's eyes had not yet turned to respect, but it was a start. Susan, humbled, sat back, reflecting. Michael, quiet and loyal, understood fully. And I, 78 years old, had delivered the lesson without raising my voice, without anger, without chaos. The weight of experience, of patience, of memory had spoken louder than any confrontation could. Later, alone in my study, I reflected on the days that had passed. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, sat back in my chair, and smiled faintly. They had seen the first wave, they had felt the shift, and in time they would understand completely. Because life teaches lessons slowly, and the best lessons, the ones that matter, are those that are learned quietly, painfully, and without the one delivering them ever raising a hand in anger. I wrote in my journal, memory outlasts manipulation, wisdom outlasts greed, and sometimes the quietest, oldest hands in the room hold the sharpest power. I leaned back, letting the light of the afternoon sun wash over the table. The family would come to understand everything in its time, but for now they had seen the first truth, that the man they tried to deceive was still alive, still aware, and still in control. And that, ultimately, is the lesson that lasts longer than money, longer than property, longer than life itself. Because in the end, respect and awareness are the true inheritance, and no one, not even your own children, can take that away.